this afternoon's presentation. I am Jessica Sniatecki. I'm an associate professor at SUNY Brockport in the Department of Healthcare Studies, and I teach in our Addictions and Behavioral Health program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Wood. I'm also a faculty member at SUNY Brockport. I'm an associate professor in our Department of Social Work, and I teach in our undergrad social work program.
So today we're going to be talking a bit about media bias and how we tackled that subject with our students and in the attempt to really enhance their information literacy. Yeah, hang on. Bear with me one sec as I get back to my, oh, did I stop? Just, hold on one second, folks. Sorry about that. I'm trying to get the PowerPoint to advance here. Let me see if I make it a presentation first. Okay, let's try this again. There we go. All right, so what we're primarily going to be focusing on today is based on the changes in the general education requirements that I'm sure many people experienced across the SUNY system. And so this presentation largely relates to the way that we approached our new information literacy student learning outcome. And this was added to our DEISJ courses, the courses that have that general education component that focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And so I've included a quote here from the SUNY policy that outlines the information literacy competency. To meet this competency, students are required to demonstrate that they understand the ethical dimensions of information use, creation, and dissemination. Okay? And so Jen and I are going to be talking about how we approach this particular component in our courses.
So in social work education, our accreditation is based on 9 educational competencies, EPAs. The focus for the policy class that I teach is on competencies 4 and 5. But I have to make note, generally we teach the policy class the second semester students are in our program, and it builds on their education in the first semester, in which we teach the DEIJ class, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice class. So in that class, one of their major assignments is a self-evaluation of implicit and explicit bias. So in social work education, our 4th competency is engaging in practice-informed research and research-informed practice. Basically, the reality that our students are going into a professional field, and they are going to be using evidence-based practice to work with vulnerable client systems. So what information are they basing that practice on? Are they basing it on the correct information? And then the assignment we're going to be talking about takes place in their policy class. And that's using the social justice, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive lenses to assess how our policies in the US and abroad affect how we can serve our clients, and then also being able to use critical thinking to analyze how our policy system works.
Thank you. So to give a little background information, some of the things that we thought about and considered as we were designing components in our courses and in particular assignments that we're going to talk about in just a minute to get at this content area. One of the pieces that I also included when I talked to my students about this area is some of what's presented here. So our access to information, firstly, has certainly shifted significantly in the last 20 years or so, right? As the internet has become so ubiquitous in our work, and as we have that instantaneous access to a variety of information, some of which is certainly more reliable than others. And one of the areas that we've really seen some significant shifts is in our news reporting. And so one of the things that I emphasized in this area with my students, and I believe Jen did as well, is some of the background of that and why things have shifted in that area. And so one of the pieces of legislation that is certainly relevant here is the Fairness Doctrine. And this piece of legislation was actually repealed, as noted here in 1987, by the Federal Communications Commission. But prior to that, this legislation required that news outlets reported both sides of the story. So they weren't allowed to focus in only on one perspective or on a narrow point of view when reporting on a particular news topic, right? Instead, they had to at least give some airtime to the opposing perspective. And that was particularly required around more debated and controversial social issues. Okay? And so because when that repeal happened, it freed up these media outlets to really only present partial information or to focus in on particular aspects of the story that might perhaps further their own the view, the views that they really wanted to emphasize to their consumers. Okay? And so because of this shift, certainly a marked shift from when I was growing up, for example, this really requires that those who are viewing those news programs or reading those news articles are much more discerning. So they need to be not only aware that this shift has occurred, but more so to be cognizant of the fact that our news no longer represents the kind of fair and impartial perspective that was kind of the outlets. Again, a little bit more on that in a minute. But not only as now do we need to as conscious consumers, read the story, but we also have to analyze whether there might be bias in that story, right? Whether there are components that are missing, or whether this particular source is trying to maybe further a particular agenda or idea over others, right? Whether it's kind of privileging certain perspectives over others.
So, in doing our research, we found a number of relevant findings. There was a recent study done of, as you could see, nearly 2 million headlines that were published over the past less than a decade in the US. And I think it's pretty obvious, but that research did show that bias and lack of impartial viewpoints in media has been increasing over that time, especially as relates to political and social issues. Now it was bad enough when it was newspapers doing it and just the news, but as you know, a lot of people get their news from any source that can come across their device. So there are issues now with social media. People on social media seeing an article and sharing it as if it's truth. Users are much more likely, due to confirmation bias, to engage with information sources, be it news, be it blogs, that confirm what they already think is true in the world or what they want to hold as true in the world. So if there's news that confirms what they already believe, that's what they're going to go with. They're generally not going to think critically and say, well, let me look and see if there's an opposing viewpoint that might make more sense. They not only that, but they will willfully ignore any contradictory information or perspectives and automatically assume that that's what's false. And college students are no different. Especially the younger generations now, they've been raised on social media. Many of them probably have never watched the news on television. And unfortunately, a lot of them, having been raised on social media, don't really have awareness of exactly how much the media and social media bias influences their beliefs, their decision making, and everything they do in their lives.
Yeah. So Jen and I both taught courses that, as I mentioned, had this component. So we're going to delve a little bit now into kind of how we specifically approach this in our classes. So my class is noted here on the slide. Again, I teach an addictions and behavioral health program. So my students are training to be substance abuse counselors. And so the course that I teach that's associated with the DEISJ component is counseling diverse populations. And so this is a class in which students learn all about different identity statuses and how they might work effectively with people with various backgrounds, right? So I did this relatively early in the semester. This was in the fall. I think it was week 3, somewhere around there. And so we had been introduced to some, main concepts around diversity and bias, things like unconscious bias, things like stereotypes, right? They were familiar basically with some of those concepts and ideas. And so in this case, I actually invited one of our librarians to come in and present on this topic because his expertise in the area certainly far exceeds mine. And it also was an opportunity just to have the students be able to hear another voice, right? And have someone else kind of telling them a bit about this area. And so Logan, my colleague, came in and spoke with the class for about an hour, and he provided a few different and interesting examples that caught the students' attention, I think, of images and headlines that were a bit skewed, right? That maybe didn't fully represent the story in its entirety, right? And all the variety of perspectives and opinions that might be included. And he also included some specific resources that students could then also use in applying their newfound learning to the subsequent assignment. We went through things like types of media bias, right? Jen mentioned one already. Confirmation bias is a huge one, right? Our tendency to pay more attention to the information that already aligns with our beliefs, and then to kind of ignore things that maybe are outside of that. Right. Another big one is just telling partial stories, right? Not including the full facts of what happened, which may skew our opinion of, what transpired, right? He also provided them with some resources to really frame that idea of assessing reliability. So what questions could you ask yourself, right? Like, how do I know this is true? Are there other sources that are saying different things? And I should mention, we're also happy to share this PowerPoint if people are interested and want to be able to click on these links themselves. But we did provide the students with some of these resources in the in-class presentation that they could then apply to their subsequent assignment. And I included, a little screenshot here of one of those resources, the allsides.com resource that does one of the, this is one of many charts. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. Sometimes they're circulated on social media and things, but they are an attempt to categorize various media sources according to their political bias, right? So those that are more left-leaning, more liberal versus those that are considered more, kind of middle of the road, more to at least perceived as having the least bias, because they can still have bias, right? And then sources that are more to the right, perhaps more conservative driven sources. And so this, like I said, is just one example, but certainly there are others that instructors might use to kind of give the students direction about which sources might have which types of a lean, if you will, in terms of their political and social agendas. And then this is a shot of the assignment they did. So I will just say first that I got to give credit to Jen here, because she's going to talk about her assignment as well, but she was gracious enough to share some of her ideas and applications in this area with me. And I kind of used her teaching approach as a way of framing this for my students as well. So after they had the presentation from the librarian and had access to these resources, students were then free to really pick a topic that they wanted to explore for this media bias assignment. And you'll see some examples there. Because this was a counseling diverse populations course, I more specifically directed them to pick a relevant social issue that was affecting people in the United States currently, right? So something like addiction could certainly be relevant, reproductive justice, mental health, immigration, right? Any of those kinds of things were open for selection. And then they were directed to identify 3 articles that looked at that issue from 3 different news sources, using some of those resources that we provided. And those 3 articles needed to be one from a more conservative source, one from a more liberal source, and then one that was considered more neutral. Okay. And then they had to, of course, read all 3 of those and do a comparison, right? So they had, I included the questions that they had to respond to here as well. But in a nutshell, they had to think about, what the articles were trying to convey to the reader, right? And how similar were they? How different were they, right? How was this story or this topic approached by these various sources? They then were called upon to more specifically identify the types of bias that were present in each article. And then think about how that might affect or shift the perspective of the reader in, absorbing that information that's being conveyed. Okay? As kind of a final component, they had to select one article that they felt had the most bias. Right? Now, this was, I didn't critique them on whether I felt they were right about that, about which one had the most bias. It just was a step for them to engage in even a little bit deeper analysis, right? So they chose the one that they felt from the previous steps was most biased, and then they fact checked it, if you will. You know, they engaged in some of the methods we had shown them for really examining in a little bit more depth its credibility and reliability. Okay? And then finally, they talked a little bit about whether they felt that article really helped them understand the situation or the social issue better, or whether maybe it was leading them down that path of misinformation or fake news.
So on a couple slides past, Jess showed you the one media bias chart. There's another one that we use. It's the Adfontes Media, and they provide not just news sources per se, but they also use blogs, all different sorts of social media sources. So I actually expanded the assignment a bit. You'll see it's almost the same type of assignment, but I said it can be an article, but it can also be a blog post, a video, or a podcast, because that's the reality of how a lot of students are getting their information these days. So I said, you just have to link me to it. So again, the assignment was, can you identify a problem? This is in a policy class, a problem that has to do with a social policy in the United States. And again, find those 3 articles. So some students found some really innovative podcasts and things like that, and it was amazing that they realized, you know, these are podcasts that I listen to all the time, and I didn't realize exactly how biased they are. Or this is a podcast that, you know, my father listens to, or this is something that, you know, my mother likes to read, and I didn't realize how incredibly one-sided the information was. And there were some students who said, I already knew this, and I only get my news from the Associated Press or BBC News, or, you know, one of those places. But it was very enriching for students. Just like Jess did, Logan came to my class too. Logan is a superstar. He does everything. But yeah, he gives them really good concrete examples of, you know, how can you tell that this is not giving you the full story?
Good. So we included a couple of things that our students said. So, you know, both our classes students had to write up a paper incorporating all these things. And so I just pulled out a couple that kind of, for me, captured some of the things that really struck me as I was reading through them in terms of the impact of the article. So I'll read them briefly, you know, for those of you who may not be able to see them well. So one student said, I never really realized that something that has to do with like addiction could become a political issue. For example, before I sat through the presentation on Tuesday, I had no idea that articles from like Fox News or the Daily Mail could be considered political based on what they're trying to say, especially if it comes to something so complicated as addiction. Another student said, it is important for us to do our own research when reading about a topic of interest. This way we can discern what is factual and what is not. Without doing this, we can be unknowingly spreading false information or biased information.
All right. So some of my students, now a lot of these are students who are planning on going into a clinical setting. So being, you know, therapists, you know, working with children, things like that. So one student said, I had no idea that so many of our elected officials base their platforms on false assumptions and stereotypes, which kind of brings back the reminder that, you know, our elected officials are human beings just like we are, just as susceptible to bias and misinformation as we are. I find it really disturbing that so many people present false information as facts, and these are intelligent people who really should know better. And it's so scary to think that professionals make decisions that impact people's lives and survival, and they don't even know how to separate fact from fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so pretty profound things. We thought that our students said, and in reflecting on those responses and those assignments that we reviewed, we had some takeaways or kind of thoughts on what this means for us and how it might impact our future in teaching and learning. So first of all, it struck, I think, both Jen and I that this was really critical information for our students, right? I mean, for myself, I think I was pleasantly surprised and maybe a little scared as to how much they needed this content. This was a new addition in my class. And I was telling Jen I had to, kind of take something else out to fit this. And so, I wanted to see how that would go, certainly. But when I read through their papers, I was just so struck by how necessary this assignment was and how many of them were just really under aware of the bias in our media sources. And I think you saw that, well reflected in the responses.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of skills that come from this. First of all, information literacy is something that every one of us should strive to do better with. Because I think probably every one of us has spread fake news at some point and believe fake news at some point. But in particular, when you look at how media is developing the world around us, we are going to be seeing a lot more involvement of AI in the media and in the news. And as we're getting to a point where people can make very believable videos and images involving people that, are artificial images, I think it's going to be incredibly important for us to know and to teach our students to be able to discern this sort of augmented reality and AI from the true reality of the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, to some extent, this is just going to get harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
To try to figure out what is real, if you will, and what is true, especially with our instantaneous access to a wide array of information.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And
And I know I'm guilty of this too, right? Just as our students are. Like sometimes when I'm looking for an answer and I Google something, I just click on the first thing that comes up, right? And I think that's kind of a human tendency. But if we don't stop and take the time to really, delve into what is this source I'm looking at, and is this actually true and accurate and fully representative of all the perspectives and all the information on this topic, then we really can be pretty quickly deceived, if you will.
we
Um,
can.
and to Jen's point, with AI, it's just going to get harder and harder, right? I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen some of those articles recently about the deep fakes, like using people's voices and things like that. Like even some of the, I think, cues that we have typically relied upon to give us hints that it's an accurate source, right? Or to show us that we're talking to a real person, even, or things like that, are going to be increasingly difficult as this technology develops and becomes more and more widespread.
For sure. And I can say that in social work as a profession and also in higher education, many of our colleagues are in denial about AI. They just don't want to
Mhm.
confront it. And it's coming. Whether or not we want it to, it's coming. So the best thing we can do is develop our own toolbox for working with it. That can start with putting AI statements in our syllabi, which we're going to start doing in social work. But burying our heads in the sand isn't going to make it go away.
Mhm. Yes, and certainly more and more of a critical skill is this, information literacy component as we continue to move forward. All right, so we did want to make sure that we reserved a little bit of time for Q&A or discussion or things people are wondering about. I think when Jen and I saw this conference, we just saw an opportunity to kind of share the ways in which we were approaching this and some of the things that we're thinking about. But certainly, and I'm going to stop sharing. Like I said, I'll certainly be happy to share the PowerPoint with anyone who would like it. But does anyone have any questions or things that we didn't talk about that you'd like to know about? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand either way.
Because we're a smaller group, if anybody wants to unmute themselves to ask a question, please do so, or put your questions, comments into the chat.
Yes, I see Dave made a comment too that I didn't see during the presentation. I just want to say that's a good reminder there, Dave. Thanks that we need to also, make sure that we are checking our own bias, right? And that we are, um, being mindful of that, even as we pull materials for our courses and things, right? Making sure that we are using those accurate sources. All right, Dave also asked, how do you work with groups or individuals on the assignments once you vet them? So are you, Dave, asking like how we would work with individual students to complete this? I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Sorry, yeah, I was just outside working in my yard and I'm
Oh,
filthy.
no problem.
I can't go on camera. No, my interest, my concern was, as you as instructors, and I'm one as well, as I make an assignment and then I
Mhm.
start to see the kind of responses, do you choose to then work with and alter the assignment individually with individual students, or do you make more of an effort to do it as a group context? And try to do it all at once, even though there might be some individuals that would probably benefit from one-on-one, shall we say.
Mhm. So the way that I approached it in terms of that like foundational knowledge and those resources and things that we gave them, we did that as a whole group. But then my students each got, when I graded their papers, individual feedback. And there were a couple of them, I will say, out of I think I had about 28 students, not a huge amount, but I want to say 4 or 5 that did reach out, throughout the time uh, from when we presented the content to when the assignment was due. That needed a little bit of individual guidance or wanted to make sure they were on the right track, that kind of thing. So there was some individual work, but mostly the context of the assignment, in my class at least, was presented in a group format.
And I'm going to echo what Jess said about that, but also I took trends that I saw in people, what people were and were not understanding. And I kind of took that as a cue to do a little more in-depth refresher on some of it in subsequent classes after I had done the evaluation of the assignments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so kind of bringing it back to the full group again and, with some observations. I think I may have actually done that as well after I graded them, just kind of said, after grading your media bias papers, these were some of my, kind of the general takeaways from the group.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Sure. And frankly, sometimes this comes up, I'll just share in my diversity class, because students will come in with questions about things that are somewhat skewed stories, right? Like one I'll share is it was actually last year, but it certainly relates to this topic. A student was asking about trans individuals who detransition, right? And had read some articles around that. And so we, as a class, I actually found a couple articles and posted them in our Brightspace module. And we talked about that, like where is this article from? And what are the context even of the stories that they are sharing in this article about these individuals who detransitioned. And in that case, one of the things that we were looking at, or that stuck out to us, is that it didn't seem that perhaps the individuals who had begun a transition process and then changed that goal had necessarily been treated by healthcare professionals using best practices. And so we as a group kind of saw that there was maybe a bit of a slant to some of those stories that might not be as representative of the trans community as we would like, right? So that also is a piece, I guess I didn't include here, but that did stick out to me as I incorporated this project, is that this topic has come up in this particular class almost every semester that I teach it, right? But just not in as structured of a way. So this, Gen Ed revision did allow me, I guess, to give more structure to this area that does frequently come up in this class, because we're talking about social issues and identities, right? So there's a variety of information presented about that from a variety of different sources.
So we're right at 1:30. So if anyone else has a question or a comment, I would ask that you put it into the chat. But if not, we're gonna go ahead and stop the recording, end it here, and I have to say this was an interesting presentation for myself also. I didn't realize some of the media I listened to is a little bit more left.
Mhm. Yes, yeah, and